What if a sailboat company decided to have no dealers and no showrooms and made a whole business model on sort of a lease to own kind of thing? And they also decided to build the boats better, way better than they needed to be.
Today on Everything You Need to Know, we're talking about Caribbean sailing yachts.
Caribbean-worthy sailing yachts weren't exactly cheap back in the 1960s and 70s. Production runs on seaworthy models were very limited, and no one was stamping out hundreds of boats a year to drive the price down in the market. In fact, very few people were actually buying large sailboats, except the people that were really rich. A dentist from New Jersey named Dr. John Van Alst got into sailing and started to see the problem, but like any great businessman, he didn't just see the problem, he set out to solve it. He saw the problem as an opportunity for a business. He came up with a really interesting solution to get more boats into the hands of more sailors, even with the high prices of boats. The business model was interesting. Dr. John would start a charter company in the Caribbean so people could simply rent the boats and use them to go Caribbean sailing for a couple of weeks, just like charter companies do today. However, there was a twist. If he wanted to start a charter company to rent out boats, he would need to buy a bunch of boats so that people could rent them out. And of course, that's a huge startup capital. Instead, he came up with his really interesting idea. A customer who wanted to buy a boat could buy it, but instead of taking delivery of the boat immediately, the charter company would use the boat, his charter company, and he would rent it out to other people until the payments were made. And once it was paid for, the boat would be delivered to the owner finally. Couple of years. Other people are using your boat. Finally, you get your boat, and it's all paid for. So it's sort of like win-win-win. This made it so his charter company could have boats, the fleet of boats that he wanted to run his charter company and make his living, without having to buy them up front. And people who wanted to rent boats to get into sailing and get used to it, they could do that. And then people who wanted to own really nice big sailboats to go Caribbean sailing, they could do that too. However, there's a catch to this business model. It all sounds really nice, but there is a pretty big catch that you have to see. The boats would need to be rock solid. They need to be bulletproof. If a potential buyer was going to let other people use their boat for the first couple years in a charter environment, the boat would have to be good. Very good. This is when Dr. John sort of founded Caribbean Sailing Yachts, or CSY as it's typically called. The goal was to build boats that were so strong and so tough that an amateur captain who wanted to rent it for a couple of weeks and bomb around the Caribbean with no experience at all or very little experience, they could rent the boat, and the boat would really need to be able to survive anything. Then after chartering off the boat for a while, it would be given to its rightful owner. To further drive the price down, CSY would have no dealers, no middlemen to sell boats. They would sell boats directly to the customer themselves, and they came up with a few cool ways to do this. They offered sea trials that you could go out on a brand new CSY to see if you wanted to buy it. They would give you a tour of the factory so you can see the boats being made to see if you wanted to buy it. They even printed huge books of like how to sail and how to go cruising and that kind of stuff, and give them to people at boat shows and things like that. They even had a few of their own boats go to boat shows, so potential owners could, if they wanted to, buy the boats outright, and that was fine. But a large number of them, most of them, would buy them with this charter deal, which was like sort of a lease to own kind of a thing. So you would buy the boat would not be delivered to you, it would go into the charter fleet that Dr. John owned. It would get chartered around for a couple years, and once its actual price tag was paid by the charter stuff, you could have your boat. The boat goes to its true eventual owner eventually, and you don't go broke buying it. Okay, so we have a business model that the dentist Dr. John has figured out, and we're gonna try to make it work. Now, if you remember a few episodes ago, I had pointed out in the 60s and 70s, in the boat building game, it was sort of a boys' club. There were 10 or 15 different well-known names that were really doing the thing. Well, Dr. John, upon founding CSY, Caribbean Sailing Yachts, needed some help to turn out some new boats. So he turned to someone he knew, a man called Ted Irwin. Now, of course, we know who Ted Irwin is. He owns Irwin Yachts, and he did all that kind of stuff. And that name has come up episode after episode after episode of boat designers. Ted was a big influence on the early designs of CSY boats. The first boat was the CSY Carib 41. You know, they only made about 40 boats, so you probably haven't seen a 41, and that's okay. But some still exist, so if you see one, that's a Ted Irwin sort of influenced boat. But the boat that usually comes to mind when you talk about CSY for most sailors is the CSY 44. The 44 was the second boat for the company, and Ted Irwin had a lot to do with it. And you can tell when you look at it, it looks a lot like an Irwin boat. It was affectionately known as the walkover, and that was because going from the aft cabin to the main cabin, or from the main cabin to the aft cabin, required going outside into the sort of center cockpit and walking outside over the center cockpit and then down another companionway to get from cabin to cabin, hence walkover. The 44 was developed specifically to be a charter boat, and therefore it had to be rock solid, tough as nails, and easy to use for inexperienced charter captains and charter families that would rent these things and bomb around the Virgin Islands with them. She had a really thick rub rail, so if you had to nail a dock, it was okay. The boat would be okay. And the keel and ballast were set up and designed specifically to take hard groundings without breaking anything. Now, the 44 was not a modern design by any means. Everything out there at that point was a racing boat, IOR and CCR and all that kind of stuff. So the old 44 CSY was actually designed to look a little bit more classic, just not exactly modern. It was designed to be comfortable and bomb around the Caribbean in safety. She came with a shoal draft 4-foot option, and if you wanted to cross oceans or something, you could get the 6-foot keel option, which was an extra 2,000 pounds of keel. And it was better suited to long passages on the ocean and things like that. And of course, on both boats, the rudder was skeg hung, of course, to provide better protection for the rudder if you're going to be running over trees and things like that. They were cutter rigged, single spreader, super simple, and the sails weren't oversized. They were actually a bit undersized to make it easier to handle it under sail with reduced crew, or in this case, with reduced experience, because chartering was the name of the game. Reefing was easy. It was easier to live with the boat with a smaller sail plan, and it was very comfortable. They even used a higher cut on their jibs to make it easier to see forward while you were out cruising. And right from the factory, you had some pretty cool options. In the 70s, this is in the 70s, mind you, you could get a diesel generator, you can get a water maker, you can even get air conditioning. This is in the 70s, so if you don't mind doing some work and some restoration sort of kind of stuff, and you can pick up a CSY 44, these charter boats that eventually got delivered to owners, you can get one for less than 100K, and they're well worth looking at. Later in production, the 44 started making, instead of the walk over, where you have to go outside to get from cabin to cabin, they started making what they called the walk through version, where you didn't have to go outside to get from cabin to cabin. And all of these versions sported an engine room, get this, standing headroom in the engine room. And they had a workbench, so you could put a vise and have all your tools hung up. I can't even imagine that sort of luxury on a cruising boat. Lady K Sailing and everything you need to know are brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to keep this channel improving. Thank you so much for making these videos possible. The CSY brand suffered from what some say was making their boats too good, if you can believe that. If it's even a thing. The problem with the business model was that they had to make boats so good that they could charter them out for a few years before actually delivering them to the buyers. So the boats had to be truly incredible and incredibly overbuilt because they put so much into making the boats, but they weren't able to sell them for as much as they were probably worth. The company did eventually go bankrupt, so that business model didn't work in the long term. Eventually, Antigua Yachts bought the rights to the 44, the most successful CSY boat. And apparently they did make some more after they bought the rights through the 80s and 90s. A couple of highly customized versions from that mold, but only 20 to 30 boats were ever made, so they're extremely rare and extremely sought after. It's interesting to see the route that Dr. John took to produce these boats, and this might be what are some of the most solid, most rugged, best cruising boats made in that entire era. He made it easier also to charter boats, and he made it easier for people that might not be able to afford the price tag of a brand new Caribbean sailor be able to afford it. So his impact on the sailing world really can't be understated.